Hey, Agile folks, welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast powered by integrity inspired solutions where we build software day in and day out in an agile manner. Today's topic, we're going to talk about how to get you started with metrics. If you've been in the Agile game for very long, you've probably run into the idea of metrics, probably from blog articles or chit chat on LinkedIn about it. And whenever people start talking about metrics, especially when it comes to agile software development, usually people have one of two reactions. One is they become very defensive about it because most of us have had bad experiences with metrics. Either our company keeps vanity metrics that don't really mean anything, or metrics are the tool of the oppressor, right? They are the spreadsheet lines that middle management uses to make decisions about who to hire and who to fire and things like that. And maybe we've been on the bad receiving end of something like that. The other response that usually happens is people think, wow, that metrics stuff sounds pretty good, but it also sounds pretty complicated. A lot of times discussions about metrics are accompanied with charts and esoteric terms like cycle time and throughput and cumulative flow and things like that. And so it seems like you would need like a whole workshop to get started on metrics. Incidentally, I do teach a workshop on metrics, but it turns out that you actually don't need a whole workshop to start using metrics with your team. So today we're going to talk about metrics, what they can bring you, and how you can get started fairly simply with some effective metrics right out of the gates. What we want to do is look at metrics as having twofold usage. One use is for forecasts, okay, to improve our ability to make a forecast on when things will be done or how many things we think can be done. The other facet of metrics is for the team to use for improvement. And what I mean by that is there's something for the team themselves to look at to make sure that they're improving in the areas, in the ways that they want to improve. At no point should the things that I'm talking about be used as a performance metric, as if teams should be hitting a certain throughput or a certain cycle time or something like that. That's not what they're for. But they are an enabler for us to make better projections, as well as within the boundaries of our own team, retrospecting on our own work. It really gives us the ability to pinpoint areas that we might want to improve and get a lot of mileage out of those areas. So let's start with technique number one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the simplest thing you can do and move to the more elaborate. I will tell you that the third thing is not very elaborate. I think you could jump right to step 3 if you wanted. And I encourage you to do that if that seems like that works. It's just that sometimes for people who are brand new to metrics, or for teams maybe that are feeling a little iffy about metrics, having a smaller start can sometimes be helpful. It's easy to get going, it gets people used to the idea, and you can still get a lot of valuable information, even if you're not doing a full-blown metrical package. So the first technique that we're going to talk about with metrics is to simply count the number of items your team completes each day. This is also sometimes known as counting cards, not to be confused with the band Counting Crows. Do you know who Counting Crows is, Cora? Okay, so for some of the listenership, Counting Crows was a band, 90s rock. Check it out, look it up. Your mom or dad probably knows who they are. But we're going to talk about counting cards today. And all this is simply keeping track of each day how many items your team got done on that particular date. Now, what are the items? It kind of depends on the way your system is set up. For us, our work items are user stories. So for me, if I were keeping track of this metric, it would be how many user stories did I complete on any given day? You may be using a system that already keeps track of this data for you, but if not, it's super easy to keep track of on your own. All you need is a spreadsheet or a table in a Google Doc or Word or something like that, and you just have dates running down one column. And then in the second column, you just record the number of things that got done that day, which could be 0. In fact, in software development teams that are working on complex things, there's some days in there where 0 is the number. Nothing in specific got done on that day. But if your team completes a card that day, then you put 1 in the column. If 2 things got done, 2 things in the column. and you just keep track of your number of cards. If this is the only metric that you keep, you're in a pretty good position to start making forecasts about how long groups of work are going to take, bodies of work are going to take. Because you can run Monte Carlo simulations, if you've heard about those, you can run that on your data set. But even just looking at the numbers and looking at the trends, you can kind of get an idea of your team's delivery rate, even just eyeballing it, which is very useful for planning purposes. If I'm looking, for instance, at that spreadsheet and I see, hey, every day we tend to get one thing done, more or less. Sometimes it's zero, sometimes it's two, but it's usually one thing. Or maybe I broaden the scope of time a little bit. If I look at every week, we usually get 2 to 3 things done. Well, that's valuable information, because then if I'm looking at, say, a project's worth of work or the next month's worth of work or whatever, and I know that we generally finish 2 or 3 cards every week, and we've got 10 cards left, well, I know it's probably going to take us about 3 to 4 weeks to burn through that work. So even just by eyeballing it, I'm already making better forecasts for my team. And if you're a Scrum team and you're trying to figure out if the work you're going to do in a sprint is realistic, this is way easier than story points. Just look at how many things you tend to get done per sprint and just use that number, or how many things you tend to get done per week, or how many things you tend to get done per day. Now, what you are looking for are the numbers that show up the most frequently. You're not looking for an average. We'll talk about that in a second. But what you're doing is looking for the numbers that show up most frequently and using some span of time where a trend starts to emerge, whether that's a day, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. But as you're looking at that, you have a better idea of what your team will normally complete in that period of time. And from the improvement standpoint, it gives you something to talk about in the retrospective, because if your completion rates are all over the map, then you can talk about what would it take for these completion rates to be more predictable? What would it take for them to be more consistent? This week we got one thing done. The next week we got 8 things done. The next week we got 2 things done. The next week we got 7 things done. So there's a seesaw pattern here, right? So why is that? Why is there the seesaw? Why do we fluctuate between getting small numbers and large numbers of things done? Why do our completion rates seem totally random? What would we have to do in order for our completion rates to be more consistent? What would we have to do to complete one thing every day or 2 things every week? What changes would we have to make as a team? Those are all great retrospective topics, and all that comes from just simply keeping track of how many things got done per day. It's a shorthand throughput measure. The second technique that I want to talk about is a little bit of an elaboration on that, and that is you start keeping track of the date that a work item was started and the date that it was finished. So one thing this does is this still gives you your completions, right? Because obviously the date that it's done, that's a date that a card got done. So that how many cards got done on that day, right? So you still have the data I talked about in step one. But what you've added to the data set now is the length of time it took to get that particular card done. So now not only can you talk about how long will it take my team to burn through a body of work items, now you can talk about how long it's likely for an individual item to take. If we start a feature, how long do we think that feature is likely going to take? Again, what you want to look for are the numbers that appear the most consistently. You don't want to use the average. Averages are always at 50-50, which means you're going to be wrong 50% of the time. And they represent the midpoint of your data set. That specific number of days might not even actually occur in your data set. So if you calculate your average time of your user stories, for instance, and you find that the average time is 7 days, it's possible that none of your user stories actually took 7 days to do. So you don't want to use the average. What you want to do is look for the numbers that recur over and over and over again. And as you see the numbers that are the most common, then you can sort of use those as shorthand planning. Or you can take a look at how many of your numbers fell under a certain limit, right? So I might look at all my numbers and be like, hey, 75% of my numbers fall under 13 days or less, or 85% of my numbers fall under 15 days or less. So then that gives me an idea. Hey, if my team starts a work item, there's an 85% chance it's going to be done in 15 days or less. So you get some really powerful tools just by making that one small change. So now, instead of just keeping track of the number of things I got done each day, now I'm keeping track of start dates and end dates. Again, most of your systems will, if you're using an electronic system, will keep track of this data for you, but it's a very easy thing to keep track of on your own, just in a spreadsheet or in a Google Doc or something. A lot of times in the daily stand-up, that's a great time. If you're keeping track of that data, that's a great time to update that data. So that helps us on the prediction side, but it also helps us on the improvement side, because as you're looking at that data, you're going to see things that are outliers. You're going to see that, hey, most of the time, our cards take between 8 to 12 days to finish, but here's this one over here that took 47 days. Why did that take 47 days? That's a great retrospective question, right? That's something we can talk about in our retrospective. Why do the outliers look the way they do? Or why did we have a bunch of cards get done in 1 and 2 days and then all of a sudden get hit with this 37-day card? What happened to that? So we can tell stories about that and figure out, are there any causes to our outliers? Are they special causes? Are they flukes? Or are they recurring causes that we might be able to fix with an improvement? The other thing you can look at is, how are your cycle times trending? Now, you want to be careful here, because cycle times are not performance metrics. You don't want your team to get the idea that they should be shooting for like a target cycle time. Work is going to take as long as it takes. Even the world's most efficient team can't eliminate all the time it takes to get work done. They can only eliminate the wasteful parts. So your work is always going to take as long as it takes. There's no target cycle time that any team can use, nor can you compare cycle times between teams as a performance metric, because they're not working on exactly the same things. So if it takes one team normally 5 days to finish their cards and it takes another team 10, it may be that the second team is just doing more complicated work. It doesn't mean that one team is inherently better than the other. So you definitely don't want your teams to ever get the idea that the cycle time is a performance indicator. But if you're looking at the trends of your cycle times, it may indicate to you that certain changes are improving things or certain changes are making things worse. For example, something I see a lot with teams when they're starting their project, usually the first few features you crank out, you're building a lot of infrastructure. And so those first few features maybe take a little bit longer. You're putting in the logging, you're setting up the website for the very first time. You're doing a lot of things for the very first time, setting up the ORM and everything that add time to those first few features. So what we would normally expect is the trend for the first few cycle times to be kind of lengthy, but then we would start to see them normalize. Well, sometimes what you see with teams is the cycle times start out actually low, and then they start drifting longer and longer and longer and longer. Almost always, that means that the team is taking on too much work at once, because cycle time is a direct correlation with the amount of work you have in progress. So if you see your cycle time start to drift longer and longer and longer, maybe it means you're working on more complicated stuff, possibly, but usually what that means is you're pulling in work faster than you can finish it, and it's slowing everything in the system down. So that's something that you can talk about in your retrospective just from that data. Finally, the third thing you can do, expanding on this idea, is instead of just keeping track of the start date and the end date of a card, is you keep track of the dates that your cards changed stage. So this is really only for teams that have actually broken down their workflow into stages. So for example, a lot of times in software development shops, you have a time where you're focused on clarifying the requirements. You're having a time that's mostly writing the code and the unit tests and things like that for the first time. And then you're having a time when things are mostly being tested, defects are being ironed out and that sort of thing. And then you might have some user acceptance stuff go on, and then you're going to deploy. So if you have this mapped out, if you have this value stream mapped out, those of you doing Kanban probably have already done this. Those of you not doing Kanban, you might want to think about trying it. But if you have it mapped out and you have your items moving through those stages, you can record the dates that your card moves into each new stage. Now, not only will this give you the data that I talked about in Techniques 1 and Techniques 2, you're going to find out how often cards get completed, and you're going to find out how long it takes a card to get completed between start and stop. But now you have an extra facet of information, and that is how long did the card hang out in each of the individual stages, and how fast are cards coming into a stage and how fast are they leaving a stage. Now, from a projection standpoint, this doesn't really give us anything more than Technique 1 would, or Technique 2 for that matter. But from a team's improvement standpoint, this is a treasure trove, because what it's going to do is it's going to show us the parts of our process that are bottlenecks, and it's going to show us where the biggest bottleneck is. It's going to show us what part of the process is controlling the length of time or the throughput of the entire process. So let's say, for example, that our QA team really gets overburdened. It takes a long time to QA. We are dumping work on them faster than they can churn it out. Well, if we're keeping track of the dates that cards move from stage to stage, we're going to see things like a user story sat in dev done for 2 weeks before a QA person was able to pick it up. Or we're going to see several cards built up in QA doing, and they stayed there for long periods of time, and they couldn't pull anything else in. We're going to start seeing where our constraint actually is. What's the part of the system that keeps things from moving forward through the chain? And that's great to identify in a retrospective, because then when we're talking about improvements, guess where we're going to focus most of our time? It's going to be on that thing, right? Because if that thing is really the slowest moving part of the machine, if we can improve it, if we can have more things moving through it more quickly, then we improve productivity across the board exponentially. Or if we can find those stages where work items are hanging out and they're just waiting there for long periods of time, if we can reduce those waiting times, if we can come up with improvements to get things out of requirements done or dev done or QA done, if we can figure out ways to reduce those times, then we get massive improvements in our delivery times for free, right? We're just cutting out dead time out of our process. So having those metrics are very, very powerful from an improvement standpoint. And I would tell you that that data set is all that you need for all the elaborate charts that you see out there, the cumulative flow diagrams, the aging work in progress reports that you see, the cycle time scatter plots, all those things that may look very arcane to you, all derive from a data set of keeping track of the dates that cards move through those stages. That's it. There's nothing magic about it. So if you feel pretty confident, if you want to get going to your fullest potential with metrics, it's pretty easy, right? You can create a spreadsheet. Again, have your user story IDs or names running down the left side. And over on the right, each of your columns is one of those stages, right? So ready for requirements, requirements doing, dev ready, dev doing, QA ready, QA doing, tests, deploy, whatever your stages are, and just record the dates next to those user stories that they moved into those stages. Again, daily stand-up is a great time to update that data. And from that data set, you can tell a lot of stuff. But if that seems like a lot of work, if it seems kind of weird, if you just kind of want to warm up to it or let your team warm up to it, think all the way back to Technique 1. Just on every day, when your team says they got something done, just total it up. We got 0 items done today. We got 1 item done today. We got 0 items done today. We got 2 items done today. Just keep track of that metric. And that alone will supercharge your ability to give good forecasts and start to introduce your team to the idea that we can look at what's happening with our metrics and actually use that as grist for the mill in our retrospectives. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.